Hi everyone, we're going to continue our study of political geography, moving into the specific kinds of conflicts that boundaries cause. So we've been going at length discussing the types of boundaries, and now we're going to shift our focus into how this sense of territoriality caused by boundaries in turn leads to conflict. So here we are, we're going to start off with what kinds of conflicts do boundaries cause. There are four types of boundary conflicts. The first one we're going to study is definitional boundary disputes. Bold term on the left-hand side of your notes. So a definitional boundary dispute, I'm going to read the definition and then we're going to break that one down a little bit. It's a dispute that focuses upon the legal language of a boundary agreement. So it's a dispute where two different states are disputing over the actual interpretation of a boundary agreement. So there's been some sort of treaty, some sort of law, some sort of agreement. And in a definitional boundary dispute, two states are disagreeing over the language and the legal implications of that treaty. So for example, Chile and Argentina, they have a definitional boundary dispute because they have a treaty that says that the boundary between the two countries is supposed to follow the highest peaks of the Andes Mountains. So that would be the territory is owned by whichever state, all the way up to the highest peak of the Andes Mountains. But now that language of the treaty is being disputed because there's oil and gas that were found in those regions. And so now the Chile and Argentina are both laying claim to the area of that boundary dispute. Typically, when countries face these kinds of disputes, this is cut off again. Typically, what the countries will do is they will take their disputes to a group called the United Nations. We're going to be discussing them at length in about 2 class periods. So the United Nations is a international supranational organization. We'll talk about that. Whose power supersedes that of individual states. And the International Court of Justice is really where those boundary disputes are hopefully resolved, as if not, that often leads to violent conflict and to war. So definitional boundary disputes are over the legal language of some sort of boundary agreement. One state believes that they have a claim to it, the other state believes they have the same based upon some sort of treaty or agreement between the states. Second type of boundary dispute is a locational boundary dispute. This is going to take some specific language to break down. Generally speaking, it's a locational boundary dispute comes up when the definition of the boundary is in question. So what the boundary is not exactly questioned, but the interpretation of the boundary is. So for example, there are two types within this concept of a locational boundary dispute. Some states often disagree over the delimitation of a boundary or a demarcation of a boundary. Let's break that down. Let's say that we have the Mississippi River. Okay? The definition of the boundary is not in question. If the states agree that the Mississippi River is their boundary, not a question, not a problem. However, what happens when the boundary moves, right? The Mississippi River has moved. So no one's questioning that the Mississippi River itself is the boundary, but now all of a sudden the interpretation, well, is it where the Mississippi River once was when we made this agreement, or is it now where the Mississippi River is as the path of the river flows? So here's an example of how the Mississippi River has shifted over time. The locational boundary dispute manifests itself or emerges in 2 separate ways again, as a delimitation of a boundary dispute or demarcation. Delimitation is when a group is seeking to draw their official borders on a map. So they're saying, this is where our border is. And another group could say, well, that's not accurate. Let's go back to this map for a second. There could be an issue of delimitation here. If one group says, well, we're going to draw the boundaries of this on a map, we're going to say where the Mississippi River actually flows is the boundary, where another group says, well, I'd say it's more where the Mississippi River was at the time of the agreement. So that's what should go on the map. That should be what's considered the boundary, the border. This itself, that would be an issue of a delimitation. What should we actually draw upon this map? Another example of that would be the areas of frontiers when we talked about Saudi Arabia and Yemen and Oman and Qatar and the UAE. The area, that frontier on the Arabian Peninsula, there'd be issues of delimitation. Where should this boundary appear on the map? Sorry, there's the bell. Secondly, we have a concept or an issue of demarcation. Okay? Demarcation could mean that one group has physically put a border up along the demarcation. Generally speaking, if you're going to demarcation means you're actually marking something, physically making an actual visual representation of something. Demarcation then of a boundary is when countries put up physical barriers, fences, or walls. So the example I have down there is the demarcation boundary conflict as it pertains to the U.S.-Mexico border. That's a particularly beautiful picture of the area there, but you can see that the fence itself has been a line of demarcation. The United States has physically put this up. Perhaps the locational dispute would be between the Mexican government and the United States government over where this how this boundary itself and how it should be interpreted. Who should the physical wall be there, or should it just simply be acknowledged as a border between the two? The map I put at the top there is actually an example of maritime or sea boundaries, of the problem of delimitation, where different countries, specifically you see there Chile and Peru, have different. It's not necessarily a question. They both agree to certain maritime laws, which we're about to talk about, but where the official boundaries actually exist, where those borders exist, is what they're disputing about. Another type of boundary dispute is called an allocational boundary dispute. So an allocational boundary dispute is one where there are conflicting claims to the natural resources of a region, which lie near or between the boundaries. So this could be complicated because when you really consider the fact that a border or a boundary, border in this sense, political boundary, is invisible, and when the entire concept of a government is that you are seeking to provide for your people, you can imagine that that finding a resource, particularly one like oil or something that's so critical, natural gas, to the actual functionality of your society, you can imagine that an allocational dispute can be quite complicated if the beginning and end of the resource don't necessarily follow the lines of the political border. So, for example, if we're considering the idea that in between Kuwait and Iraq, there are tremendous conflicts over resources, because if there is oil found in the border region between the two, that's a tremendous economic opportunity that both governments are going to absolutely want to capitalize on. So an allocational boundary dispute is one that's very specific to finding natural resources. That's got to be the key. The allocational boundary disputes are ones where it's a dispute that is relevant to finding natural resources that fall right along the border between two countries. Now, that's not to say, now that doesn't mean, as I'm going to go back to that map for just a second, as you see here, these are natural resources found on land, so the border between the two countries on land. However, so many of the world's natural resources are found at sea, and which brings up the entire other question, well, where does sovereignty, and how does sovereignty or control, just generally speaking, apply to water? Who owns water? So, in 1983, the United Nations, that group I mentioned again, this supranational organization, an organization where countries are all working together for some greater cause, the United Nations took this issue head on and created what is known as the United Nations Law of the Sea. What this says is that states have territorial rights 12 miles from land. That means, quite simply, that the borders of a country extend 12 miles outside of their physical territory. They own that land. However, each country has what's called an exclusive economic zone. That says that states have exclusive, meaning they're the only ones, states have exclusive rights to explore and extract resources up to 200 miles from the land. So let's go back for a minute. This is again relevant to an allocational boundary dispute, because this is a dispute. These are policies intended to prevent allocational disputes. Who owns what at sea was what the entire premise of this law, the entire basis of this law. So states own 12 miles off land. They control up to 200 miles off land in their exclusive economic zones. It's not that easy, though. It's pretty complicated. Look, ignore the words on the right on the left for just a second, because I want us to focus on this map here. They're called the EEZs, the exclusive economic boundaries in the high seas. We'll take that to a side for a second, but the EEZs of the United States. Well, you can immediately, it's evident that the EEZs, the exclusive economic zones of the United States, would interfere with the rights of certain countries. For example, the 200 miles off the coast of Texas would likely interfere with the I'm just wish you guys can see my cursor, but it would interfere with the exclusive economic zones of Mexico. So while the United Nations laws of the sea isn't necessarily, or is a good policy, it's not necessarily foolproof, because clearly those things overlap, which in turn means, which leads us to what is now on the left-hand side here, the median line principle. The idea that when these these exclusive economic zones overlap, the rule of thumb is to divide the exclusive economic zone in half, control of the water that is equidistant from both parties. So wherever so the line is drawn so that the exclusive economic zone is equidistant from both, let's say in this example, Mexico and the United States. So quite simply, you divide it in half. That's kind of the concept of the median line principle. This is the rule of thumb for how to control rivers. So if there are two states that control, and I'm using that states to refer again to countries, of course, two states that have borders that are defined by a body of water, as would be the case in some of the African Great Lakes regions, or rivers that define the boundaries between states. The median line principle says that the river is divided in half and the territorial boundaries extend from there. As you can imagine, this isn't necessarily a foolproof system, and this is going to continue to lead to conflicts, which is why the existence of things like the United Nations is so important, because the United Nations is where conflicts that do arise from these principles can be resolved without countries going to war. As I said there too, let's just build on this a little bit with some more discussion about boundaries at sea. As I mentioned, their conflicts are going to inevitably arise, can't be avoided, because natural resources are, as I said, obviously often found underwater, simply because such a tremendous portion of Earth's surface is covered by water. So here's an example. The Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands are both in the South China Sea. And you can see here, I mean, this map itself is it's kind of busy to look at, because all of these those islands, they're as you can see down, I really need to get my arrow going again. The Paracel Islands, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner where it's labeled, and the Spratly Islands, you can see that those are the two areas that, that those are the different countries that are laying claim to those same territorial conflicts. They're claimed by China, by Vietnam, by Indonesia, by the Philippines, by Malaysia. All are claiming that it's within their exclusive economic zone, that's within their territory, so on and so forth. And you can see in the top left-hand side that the agreed maritime boundaries, you can see from 1995 to 2000, the evolution of all of the different conflicts and treaties that the Southeastern Asian region has had to come to as a result of these conflicting territorial claims. You can even see here on letter H where it says declared limits. It even mentions the Taiwan, the existence of Taiwan, which China does not recognize as an independent state, but the Taiwanese people most certainly do. Last type of boundary dispute is called an operational boundary dispute. Now, I'm going to use the same example I used before about the demarcation of a boundary, when you're physically putting walls up, like the Berlin Wall, again, was a demarcation. Or the DMZ in Korea would be the example of a demarcation, because there's there's a physical presence there. In the DMZ, I'm referring primarily to the guards, the stands of guards in the DMZ. Anywho, back here to operational boundary disputes. Operational boundary dispute is a dispute that focuses on how the boundary should function. So, for example, U.S. and Mexico often disagree of issues about undocumented workers, undocumented immigrants that are coming across the borders. The treatment, the process, the U.S. Border Patrol and customs processes over which Mexico does not have control often is a source of conflict. So this is in an operational boundary dispute. It's basically the concept that the two countries are disagreeing over major issues about the usage of this boundary and how this boundary should function, how it should be controlled. You can kind of think of that like if two countries had border control, very different concepts of border control. One country wants to have open borders, the other country wants to have, as you see here, as the U.S.-Mexico wall, that you'd want to have the border completely closed off to another group of people. Okay. This is just a little summary here in case I just took this from the AP Kaplan book. If this was a little bit confusing, as I imagine some of it was, this is a nice little summary. You can pause and simply read through this because some of these, there is a lot of overlap here, particularly when it comes to locational boundary disputes versus operational boundary disputes. I find that those are a little bit, those lines get a little bit blurry sometimes. So if you need to, pause here and just take a look at that. And then lastly, here are your analysis questions. Please do these on a separate sheet of paper. And you'll notice for number 2, when I say that based upon the morphology of the states, that's a reference to the last flip video about how the shapes of states influence the boundary disputes. Alrighty, thanks guys.